The crash happened at 11:47 p.m. on a rain-slicked highway outside Seoul. One moment, Kang Min-Jae was in the back seat of his armored black Mercedes, scrolling through port manifests on his encrypted tablet. His tie loosened, his mind running through numbers with the cold precision of a man who had built an empire not just through violence, but through relentless calculation. The next moment, there was a sound like the world breaking apart. A tremendous impact from the left side, a shattering of reinforced glass, the scream of metal folding inward, and then darkness swallowed everything. The machines were already beeping when he became aware of himself again. He did not know how much time had passed. He did not know where exactly he was, though the antiseptic smell and the steady rhythm of monitors told him hospital. What he knew, what struck him with a terror more paralyzing than any physical pain, was that he could not move, could not open his eyes, could not speak, could not even make a sound to signal that behind the stillness of his face, behind the silence his body offered the world, there was a mind that was awake, alert, listening. A doctor's voice, somewhere above and to his left. Glasgow Coma scale is 5, severe brain trauma, unresponsive to all stimuli. Will continue monitoring, but the prognosis is not encouraging. Footsteps, the click of a door, quiet. Then a chair being pulled close. Then the soft sound of a woman sitting beside his bed. Then, and this was what made every nerve in his conscious but paralyzed body go rigid, the sound of his wife beginning to cry. Park Soo-yeon had been crying for several minutes before she spoke. He had known her for 11 years, had married her 6 years ago, had watched her navigate the treacherous social world of his empire with a grace and composure that had impressed even the most battle-hardened men in his organization. He had never once heard her cry like this. Not at funerals, not when things went wrong, not even during the years early in their marriage when she had slowly come to understand the full dimensions of what her husband was. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I never meant for them to hurt you," she said. "I want you to know that. I need you to know that. Whatever happens, I need... Min-Jae, I'm so sorry." Silence. The machines kept beeping, and Kang Min-Jae, feared leader of the most powerful criminal organization in South Korea, controller of half the port operations on the western coast, owner of shell companies and tech fronts and underground enterprises that stretched from Busan to Beijing, Kang Min-Jae lay absolutely still and listened to every word his wife said. He did not yet know who them was, but he was going to find out. Before the crash, before the hospital, before any of it, Min-Jae had been having an ordinary night. That was the part that stayed with him later when he had the leisure to reflect on it, how utterly ordinary the night had been before it stopped being ordinary. He had been at a late dinner at a private restaurant in Aptijong, a routine quarterly meeting with the 4 senior captains that managed the port operations. The food was good. The conversation was efficient. He had reviewed numbers that were, as usual, better than they needed to be. He had drunk half a glass of whiskey and switched to water, as he always did in the second half of any meeting, because he had learned long ago that clarity in the second half of a conversation was more valuable than the loosening effect of alcohol in the first half. He had made 3 decisions and deferred 2. He had, at approximately 10:45 p.m., said goodnight to everyone and gotten into his car. He had noticed in the car that his phone showed a missed call from Soo-yeon. He had noted it as something to address when he got home. He had looked at the time and calculated that he would be home in 40 minutes, assuming normal traffic. He had not called her back. He had thought about it. His thumb hovered over her name for a second. Then he had gone back to the port manifests, which required his attention, and the call had been deferred. The route change happened at the last highway interchange before the elevated section outside the city. His brother had sent a message through the driver, something about construction on the standard route, a suggestion to take the secondary bypass. Min-Jae had glanced at the message and thought nothing of it. Route adjustments happened regularly, and Tae-Jon managed logistics for the organization. It was within the normal range of his responsibilities. He had gone back to his tablet. He didn't remember the impact. He remembered looking up from the screen a fraction of a second before it happened, some instinct that he hadn't been able to act on quickly enough. And then, nothing. To understand what Min-Jae had built, you had to understand where he had come from. The son of a dock worker from Incheon who had died of a workplace injury when Min-Jae was 9, he had spent his teenage years in the streets around the port district, running errands for older men who smelled of cigarettes and talked about money with the reverence other people reserved for religion. By 20, he was doing more than running errands. By 23, he had survived 2 gang wars that had killed men twice his age and 3 times his size. By 27, he had consolidated enough territory, enough relationships, and enough leverage over enough people that the organization he led was not merely one faction among many. It was the center of gravity around which every other criminal enterprise in Seoul had to orient itself. He called the organization Nothing. It had no name, no insignia, no dramatic mythology. That was deliberate. Min-Jae had studied the organizations that fell, the ones that got romantic about themselves, that named themselves, that printed their mythology on their chests, and he had noted that mythology made people careless. It gave prosecutors handles to grab. It gave rivals a symbol to attack. Namelessness was a kind of armor. He controlled 3 primary revenue streams. The first was the port operations. Through a network of shipping companies, logistics firms, and customs relationships, his organization managed the movement of goods that were not supposed to move. Not just drugs, though those were there. Electronics, luxury goods. People, sometimes, though Min-Jae had placed strict limits on that particular business, not out of morality alone, but because it attracted the wrong kind of attention and the wrong kind of enemies. The second stream was the tech front, a portfolio of legitimate-looking software companies and financial services firms that processed money, cleaned it, returned it to the world in the form of investments and dividends and consulting fees. The third was the underground entertainment network, exclusive casinos, private clubs, invitation-only events where the wealthy and the powerful came to do the things they could not do in public. These were in some ways the most valuable part of the operation, not because of the money they generated, though that was substantial, but because of the information. Min-Jae had always said, "The greatest weapon is silence." What he meant by this was not the silence of inaction, but the silence of the listener. The man who speaks is giving away information. The man who listens is accumulating it. He had built his empire as much through knowing things as through controlling things. He knew about the prosecutor whose wife had a gambling problem. He knew about the police commander whose son had been at one of his clubs on a night when something regrettable had happened. He knew about the politicians, the judges, the bankers. He knew, and they knew he knew, and that knowledge was a kind of invisible architecture that held the whole structure together. His wife, Park Soo-yeon, was the public face of their partnership. Elegant at charity events, sharp at the corporate functions associated with the legitimate businesses. warm and composed in a way that consistently surprised people who had expected the wife of a crime lord to be either frightened or coarse. She had a background in international finance, a network of connections in Seoul's legitimate business world, and a quality Min-Jae had recognized from their first meeting. She understood that in a room full of people performing versions of themselves, the wisest thing to do was to watch and learn before deciding what version of yourself to perform. He had, he thought, loved her for this. He had certainly respected her for it. His younger brother, Kang Tae-jun, was a different matter entirely. 7 years Min-Jae's junior, Tae-jun had grown up in the shadow of an older brother who was becoming, year by year, something larger than life. This was not a comfortable position. Tae-jun was intelligent, no one could deny that, and ambitious, and possessed of a charm that Min-Jae lacked. What he did not have was patience. He had been brought into the organization in his late 20s, had risen steadily through it, and managed his responsibilities with competence and occasional brilliance. But competence had never seemed like enough to Tae-jun. He wanted the center. He wanted to be the one whose name was spoken with that particular combination of fear and respect. He had never said this openly, he was too smart for that, but he had watched him for years and had seen it clearly. Then there was Cho Jin-ho, the right-hand man. 15 years with Min-Jae, present at the gang wars in the early years, present at the consolidations, present at every critical negotiation. A man of almost no visible ego, which was one of the reasons Min-Jae had trusted him so completely. Jin-ho did not seem to want things for himself. He seemed to want the organization to function. This was, Min-Jae had always believed, the most valuable quality a lieutenant could possess. And finally, there was Prosecutor Oh Sung-hoo, a man who had spent 8 years trying to find a path through the architecture of shell companies and intermediaries that shielded Min-Jae from legal consequence. A man who had come close twice and had been redirected both times through means that Min-Jae preferred not to discuss in any room that wasn't completely secure. Oh Sung-hoo was persistent in the way that some men become when a case becomes personal. Min-Jae respected this distantly, in the way one might respect a force of nature that one was continually having to manage. This was the world that had produced the crash. These were the elements. In the hospital bed, unable to move, Min-Jae did not yet know how they had combined, but Soo-yeon had said them, and she had said she didn't mean for them to hurt him, and she had said she was sorry. These were the threads, and he had nothing to do now but follow where they led. If you're finding this story compelling, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. Now let's get back to the hospital room. The first 48 hours were a kind of education. But before the listening began in earnest, Min-Jae had to contend with something he had never had to contend with before: powerlessness. He had been shot once in his 20s, during the second of the gang wars that had defined his rise. He had been beaten badly once by men who had later regretted it deeply. He had faced moments of genuine danger in which he had felt the particular cold clarity that comes when a person understands that their life might end. But in all of those moments, he had been able to act. He had been able to calculate, to move, to speak, to apply one of the many forms of force he had at his disposal. He had never been helpless. Now he was completely helpless, and he had to decide in the first hours of consciousness what to do with that. The first option, the obvious one, was to fight through it, to concentrate with every neuron he had on moving, on forcing his body to respond, on breaking out of whatever neurological lockdown the trauma had imposed. The problem with this option was that the people who came into his room believed he was unconscious. The moment he showed signs of consciousness, the doctor would be called. And the doctor, as he had now pieced together from overheard fragments, was not working in his interest. Waking up too soon meant dying very shortly afterward. The second option was to wait, to lie still, to be exactly what everyone believed him to be, absent, gone, already in all practical ways, dead. Min-Jae had built his empire in part because he understood something that most people do not. Patience is not a passive quality. Patience is an aggressive act. To wait deliberately in a situation that demands action, to choose stillness over movement, to hold power without exercising it, this is not weakness. This is the most disciplined form of strength. He chose to wait, and while he waited, he listened. He had always been good at processing information quickly, at holding multiple threads in his mind simultaneously, at building mental models of complex situations from incomplete data. Now, stripped of every other capability, he discovered that these faculties, freed from the distraction of action, of speech, of the constant management of his physical presence in the world, became extraordinarily sharp. He was nothing but attention. He was all ear. What he heard in those first 2 days was the ecosystem of a hospital, an environment designed around the assumption of unconsciousness, which meant that people behaved in it as though they were unobserved. The nurses spoke to each other in the hallway about their personal lives, about their supervisors, about difficult patients on other floors. The cleaning staff moved through the room with quiet efficiency and occasionally hummed to themselves. A security guard walked past the door at regular intervals, every 40 minutes in the daytime, every hour at night, which told him that someone had arranged a specific watch on his room beyond the standard hospital protocols. That detail was interesting. Standard hospital security did not involve timed patrols past a specific room. Someone had requested it. Someone who either wanted him protected or wanted to ensure that he remained exactly where he was. He filed this. He also began in those first hours to take inventory of his own body. He could feel his hands. He could feel his feet. The paralysis was not, he suspected, neurological damage. It felt more like the extreme heaviness that comes with certain medications, the kind that suppress voluntary movement while leaving sensation intact. Someone had dosed him. Not enough to kill him outright, that would have been too obvious, but enough to ensure that if any remaining consciousness tried to express itself, the body would not cooperate. This knowledge, paradoxically, was reassuring. It meant the damage from the crash was survivable. It meant that what was holding him here was chemical, not permanent. It would wear off. The question was whether the doctor would replace it before it did, and whether Min-Jae could be conscious, informed, and strategically patient enough to make use of what he learned. He decided he could. The hospital room developed its rhythms. The nurses came every few hours, checking vitals, adjusting equipment, occasionally speaking to him in the soft, slightly raised voices that people use when addressing those they aren't sure can hear them. 2 of them, he noticed, spoke to him as though he might be listening. One of them, a young woman whose name tag he couldn't see but whose voice he came to associate with the 4 a.m. check, would sometimes say quiet things that weren't medical. "I hope you can feel your family being here. I hope wherever you are, it's peaceful." He filed this away. There was something genuine in her voice, something that distinguished it from the other sounds in the room. The doctor, Dr. Park Yang-soo, he gathered from the way other staff addressed him, was efficient, not unkind, but fundamentally focused on the physical machinery of Min-Jae's survival. He spoke to the nurses about numbers. He spoke to Soo-yeon about probabilities. He did not speak to Min-Jae at all. And then there were the visitors, and the conversations that happened in the corridor just outside the room, through the gap under the door, and the phone calls taken in hushed voices by people who seemed to think his stillness meant his absence. Soo-yeon came every day. For the first 2 days, she said very little, sat with him, held his hand, occasionally wept quietly. He could feel the warmth of her hand around his, and he concentrated intensely on not gripping it back, not doing the thing his body wanted to do when something in it recognized her touch. On the 3rd day, she began to talk. "Your brother came to the office today," she said. "He held a meeting. He said it was to reassure the captains that operations would continue normally." A pause. "It wasn't that." Min-Jae waited. "He moved Choi from the port division, put one of his own people in, Jin-sok. You know Jin-sok, he's been Taeju's man for years. And he asked the accountants to prepare a full asset review." Her voice was very controlled. "I told him it was premature. He said that responsible leadership required preparation for all contingencies." Another pause. "He said it very gently," she added. "He has that way of saying things gently." Min-Jae knew exactly what she meant. He had watched his brother deploy that gentleness for years, the way it made it harder to object to things, the way it made objection seem like aggression rather than reasonableness. In his still body, his mind was already building a map. On the 4th day, something new happened. A voice he didn't recognize at first, low and cautious, speaking to someone in the hallway. He strained to hear through the gap under the door. "Their vitals are stable, but he's not responding. If they stay stable without improvement for another 72 hours, the family has options." "What kind of options?" Another voice, also unfamiliar. "The kind that allow for a dignified transition." A long pause. He should know. He already knows. He's the one who made the contact. Footsteps moving away. Min-Jae lay in the darkness behind his closed eyes and processed what he had just heard. He was not entirely surprised. The possibility had been present at the edges of his thinking since Soo-yeon's first whispered confession. But hearing it stated so plainly, in such clinical language, the kind that made murder sound like a procedure, produced something in him that wasn't quite fear. It was clarity. On the 5th day, Tae-jun visited. He came alone in the early afternoon, and he sat in the chair beside the bed for a long time without speaking. He could smell his cologne, always the same one, a gift from Min-Jae years ago, though he doubted Tae-jun remembered that. He could hear his brother's breathing, slightly uneven in a way that suggested either nerves or guilt or both. "I don't know if you can hear me," Tae-jun said finally. His voice was quiet, not the public gentleness, something raw. "You never really gave me a path, Hyung." The word for older brother deployed with a complicated tenderness. "You built everything. You held everything. You were the center of everything. There was I couldn't see where I fit except as your shadow. Do you understand what that feels like? To be the shadow of something so large?" A long silence. "They came to me," Tae-jun continued, "the Shin organization. They'd been watching for years, waiting for a moment. And when they came to me, I thought I could manage it. I thought I could take control of something on my own terms before they simply took it from both of us. I thought—" He stopped. "I told them it had to look like an accident. I told them no one was supposed to be seriously hurt. I told them the security delay was just to make the crash possible, not to—" His voice broke slightly. "I didn't think the brake system would fail that badly. I didn't think it would go this far." More silence. "The doctor, Dr. Park, he's being paid. If you show signs of consciousness, he's supposed to administer something. I told them that was unnecessary. They said it was insurance. Taejun's voice dropped further. I couldn't stop them from that part. In the bed, Min-Jae was very still, stiller than he had ever been, even in moments of genuine stillness, because what his brother had just given him, this confession spoken to what was believed to be an empty silence, was everything. Not just information, evidence, witness testimony from the conspirator himself, delivered in his own voice, containing specifics, the Shin organization, the bribed doctor, the brake system. The question was what to do with it. He thought of Soo-yeon's words, "I never meant for them to hurt you." And his brothers, "I told them no one was supposed to be seriously hurt." The two confessions had the same shape, not innocence exactly, but not full predation either. People who had been caught between forces larger than themselves and had made the catastrophically wrong choice. This was not exculpatory, but it was information. The 6th day brought Dr. Park's supervisor into the room. A brief visit, checking something in the chart, asking the nurses routine questions. After he left, one of the nurses, the young woman with the 4 a.m. voice, stayed behind. She stood near the window for a moment. Then she said quietly, "If you can hear me, I want you to know that I'm not part of whatever arrangement Dr. Park has. I don't know everything that's happening, but I know something is wrong, and I know that patients deserve to have someone in their corner." She paused. "There's a digital recorder in the drawer by your left hand. I put it there this morning. I've been recording the room audio for 3 days. I thought someone should." She left. Min-Jae processed this for a long time. The young nurse had taken an extraordinary risk. She had made a decision independently to do something that could end her career or worse, based on nothing more than her own perception that something was wrong and her own sense of what was right. He filed her away under a category he rarely used: loyal without obligation. On the 7th day, Soo-yeon came back. She sat down. She was quiet for a while. Then she began to speak, and this time she told him everything. Her father had run a private investment fund in the mid-2000s. The fund had made a catastrophic series of decisions, had leveraged itself past all reason, and ultimately collapsed, taking with it the savings of 160 investors. Her father had not gone to prison. The legal architecture was complicated enough that intent was difficult to prove, but he had been destroyed professionally, and more than destroyed financially. The debts were substantial. The Shin organization had been one of the investors, and the Shin organization had a very particular approach to outstanding debts. "They came to me 2 years ago," Soo-yeon said. "Not directly at first, a mutual contact, just information," they said, "just passing along certain operational details, nothing that would hurt you, just enough to let them understand your movements." Min-Jae lay still. "I told them no at first. They told me what would happen to my father. I told them no again." She took a breath. "They showed me photographs of my father, of what they would do to him." Her voice was utterly even now, in the way that voices become when a person has processed a thing past the point where it can produce visible emotion. Her hand found his on the bed. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not asking for that. You always said the greatest weapon is silence. I think I finally understand what you meant. I've been silent about the wrong things for too long for the wrong reasons." She let go of his hand and stood. "Your brother's meeting is tomorrow afternoon. They're going to formalize the leadership transfer. The asset review is complete. The Shin organization has people ready to move." She paused at the door. "If any part of you can hear this, I thought you should know." The door closed softly. Min-Jae lay in the darkness and thought. He had 48 hours. He had a complete picture of what had happened and why. He had confessions from the 3 primary participants. He had a nurse who had been recording the room for 3 days. He had a doctor who was planning to murder him with an injection if he showed signs of consciousness. He had a brother who had handed his empire to a rival organization out of resentment and ambition and a failure of imagination. He had a wife who had betrayed him under duress and was now, in her own way, trying to undo it. And he had something else, something that had been building in him over 7 days of absolute stillness, of lying in this bed and hearing the truth of every person who came near him. A deep, clarifying rethinking of everything he had built. He had built an empire on fear, fear of consequences, fear of him, fear of what the organization could do to people who didn't cooperate. He had thought this was strength. He had thought that the architecture of fear was what kept things standing. What the last 7 days had shown him was something different. That fear, when it grew large enough, turned inward. His own organization's fear of him had driven his brother to conspire with rivals. His own wife's fear, not of him, but of what his world had brought to her door, had made her a channel for his enemies. The people who surrounded him had not been loyal. They had been afraid. And when fear becomes large enough, people will do anything to end it, even if what they do creates worse fear. He had always said the greatest weapon is silence. He had meant something narrow by it. He understood now that he had been half right and half wrong. Silence was powerful, but only if what you chose to hear in the silence was the truth, and only if what you chose to do with the truth was something other than another application of fear. He lay in the darkness and made his decisions. The morning of the 8th day, Min-Jae heard Dr. Park enter the room at 6:15 a.m. The doctor moved with the efficiency of someone who had done a thing many times in his imagination and was now, finally, moving to do it in reality. He heard the drawer on the left side of the bed being opened, then a hesitation, perhaps noticing the recorder, perhaps not, then closed. He heard the doctor checking the IV line. He heard the specific sound of a syringe being prepared, the tiny click of a cap being removed, the faint sound of something being drawn up. The boardroom meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. Taejun's people had been assembling since the previous evening. The Shin organization's representatives were already in the city. The asset transfer documents were prepared and were waiting for signatures. The doctor moved closer. He heard the same nurse, the one with the 4 a.m. voice, enter the room. "Dr. Park," she said, "the patient in room 7 is asking for you." A pause. "I'm in the middle of something." "Dr. Choi says it's urgent. It's a family matter. They're asking specifically for you." Another pause. The syringe sounds stopped. Footsteps toward the door. The door opened and closed. The nurse was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, "I know you can hear me. I saw your hand move this morning, just slightly, when Taejun said what he said yesterday. I've been watching." A pause. "The recorder has everything. If you're ready, if you decide you're ready, I'll be here." Min-Jae made his decision. He had been making it, actually, for 8 days. He had been making it since Soo-yeon whispered her apology into the dim hospital room, since his brother's voice broke on the word hyung, since the nurse placed the recorder in the drawer without anyone asking her to. He moved his right hand. Not dramatically, not the sudden grip of a thriller's climax, but a deliberate, controlled movement, the fingers closing and opening once, clearly intentional. The monitors responded, his heart rate shifted, his breathing changed. The nurse said nothing for a moment. Then she pressed the call button and said, very calmly, "This is room 4. We have a response." What happened in the next 90 minutes was controlled chaos. Doctors arriving, tests being conducted, the incredulous faces of medical staff confronting something that their prognosis had suggested was not supposed to happen. Dr. Park arrived at some point and stood near the back of the room, and Min-Jae, his eyes open now for the first time, held the doctor's gaze for a long moment. He watched the doctor understand what that look meant. Then he said, his voice rough from 8 days of disuse, to the nurse with the recorder, "Get me a phone." The boardroom was on the 42nd floor of the Kang Holdings Tower in Gangnam. Technically a legitimate real estate holding company, practically the administrative center of everything Min-Jae controlled. The room had been prepared for a significant occasion. Tae-jun stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit, looking composed in the way that a person looks composed when they have rehearsed the moment many times and are now living inside it. Around the table were 12 of the senior captains of the organization. 3 of them had been with Min-Jae since the early years and had significant doubts about what was happening. 2 of them were openly Tae-jun's. The rest were watching and waiting to see which way the wind was blowing, as men in their position always do. There were also 2 men from the Shin organization, nominally present as business consultants. Tae-jun had just finished explaining that, given the medical prognosis, it was necessary and responsible to formalize a leadership transition, when the elevator doors at the far end of the room opened. Min-Jae walked in. He was, objectively speaking, not at his best. He had been in a hospital bed for 8 days. He was slightly thinner, slightly paler, and he was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was reminding him of what it had been through. But he walked in without assistance in the suit that the nurse had located for him from somewhere he hadn't asked, and he walked to the head of the table where his brother was standing. Tae-jun's face cycled through several expressions very quickly: shock, then something that might have been relief. Then, as he processed what Min-Jae's presence meant, fear. Min-Jae said nothing for a moment. He looked around the table. He looked at the 2 men from the Shin organization who had arrived at this meeting as the architects of a careful plan they had spent 2 years building, and they were looking at the device with the expressions of men watching a structure they trusted collapse. This device has been recording the room audio in my hospital suite for the last 5 days. He looked at the 12 captains. 3 of you visited and said things I found informative. You know who you are. One of the captains, Lee Byung-chul, a man who had been with the organization for 9 years, shifted in his seat. He said nothing, but he shifted. I am not going to address each of those visits individually. What I am going to say is that I know what was planned, I know who agreed to what, and I know the timeline. I also know which of you came because you were summoned and said what you were expected to say, and which of you came because you were genuinely part of what was being built. I have spent 8 days doing nothing but sorting these things out, and I am confident in my assessment. He looked around the table slowly. For those of you who were summoned and cooperated because you thought it was the only option available to you, I understand the situation you were in. I am not without sympathy for the position that puts a person in. We will discuss what comes next individually, and I will be direct with you about what I need and what I can offer. He paused. For those of you who participated enthusiastically, you know who you are as well. I will not be addressing that today, but I will be addressing it. Count on it. The silence in the room had a texture to it now, the specific texture of people calculating furiously while trying not to look like they were calculating. The doctor who was paid to ensure I didn't recover is currently being interviewed by prosecutor Oh Song-woo. I called Oh Song-woo from the hospital this morning. I offered him something he has wanted for a long time, a complete account of the Shin organization's operations, including their penetration of my own structure. He found this interesting. The older of the two Shin representatives said, very quietly, "You understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Min-Jae said. "I'm dismantling a 40-year-old criminal organization by handing its documentation to a prosecutor. What I'm doing is ending something that should have ended before it killed someone." He paused. "I'm also ensuring that neither you nor anyone associated with your organization will have any further interest in me, my family, or anyone who has ever worked with me. Because what I'm handing to Prosecutor O is incomplete. The remainder becomes complete only if something happens to any of those people. I think you understand the logic." The older man was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood. The younger one stood. They left. Min-Jae watched them go. Then he looked at his brother. Tae-jun had not moved during any of this. He was sitting very still, his hands flat on the table, his face doing something complicated. "I heard what you said in the hospital room. I know what you thought you were doing. I know what they told you, and I know what you believed." He paused. "You're going to leave Korea. You're going to go somewhere distant and build something of your own that has nothing to do with this. I will provide resources for a start. The condition is that you never come back to this organization, that you never make contact with the Shin organization or any of its affiliates, and that you never again mistake my willingness to explain things for weakness." Tae-jun's jaw was tight. "And if I say no? Then the portion of the recorder that contains your hospital visit becomes part of what I give Prosecutor O." Min-Jae held his brother's gaze. "You would not enjoy the consequences. But more than that, and I need you to hear this part, Tae-jun, you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing that you ended up in prison because you chose pride over survival. I'm offering you survival." A long silence. Tae-jun said nothing for a long time. He was looking at the table, not at Min-Jae, and his jaw was working slightly in the way it always done when he was struggling with something. Finally, he looked up. "Where am I supposed to go?" "I've prepared documentation for a business venture in Lisbon, a legitimate one, logistics consulting for European shipping companies. It will take you 3 to 5 years to make it profitable. The work is real, and it is hard, and it is not what you imagined for yourself." Min-Jae held his brother's eyes. "It is also entirely yours. No shadow." Something moved through Tae-jun's face. It was not gratitude exactly. It was too complicated for that, too tangled with all the other things he was feeling. But it was something. Tae-jun nodded once stiffly and stood. He paused at the door and looked back. For a moment, through the careful composure, something else showed. Something that might have been the younger brother who had grown up watching an older brother become something immense, who had spent decades feeling the weight of that shadow, something almost young. "I really didn't want you to die," he said. "I know," Min-Jae said. "Neither did I." The door closed. He looked around the table at the remaining captains. Some of them were afraid. Some of them were calculating. The 3 oldest, the ones who had been there from the beginning, were watching him with an expression he recognized, the expression of men who had been waiting to see what kind of man he really was, and were now, perhaps, finding out. "We're changing," Min-Jae said, "not because we have to, because I've been lying in a hospital bed for 8 days, hearing the truth about what fear does to people, and I'm not interested in running an empire based on something that eats itself." He looked at each of them in turn. "The port operations transition to legitimate logistics over the next 18 months. The entertainment network closes. The financial infrastructure continues, but only for legal purposes. The organizations that don't adapt to this will find alternative arrangements without my involvement. One of the captains, Park Dong-hyun, a heavyset man who had been with the organization for 12 years, said slowly, "The profit margins on the legitimate side won't support the same." "I know," Min-Jae said. "We will have less money. We will also have fewer enemies and a greatly reduced probability of being killed by people inside our own organization." He looked at him evenly. "I consider this a reasonable trade." Park was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. He found Soo-yeon that evening in their apartment. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, and when he walked through the door, she looked at him with an expression that contained so many things simultaneously that it was difficult to name any one of them. She had not been at the boardroom meeting. He had not called her. He had let her spend the afternoon with the uncertainty of not knowing what was happening, which was perhaps unkind, but he had needed to do the boardroom without her presence complicating things. She stood up when he came in. She said nothing. He sat down across from her at the table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He thought about what she had said, about silence, about the wrong things, about finally understanding what he meant. He thought about her hand around his in the hospital room. He thought about Tae-jun saying he really didn't want you to die, and about the nurse who had placed a recorder in a drawer without anyone asking her to, and about 8 days of lying in the dark, hearing the complicated truth about everyone he trusted. He thought about what he had built, and what it had cost, and what it had nearly cost. "I know about your father," he said. "I know what they threatened. I know you thought you were protecting him." He paused. "I want you to know that I also know you told me. I know that when it counted, you told me what was coming." He looked at her steadily. "So that's not nothing." Her face had gone very still in the way it went when she was containing something large. "What happens now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "We're changing," he said. "The organization, the way things work. I've spent 8 days learning what I should have learned a long time ago about what I built and what it does to people." He paused. "I'm not making promises about what I am, but I'm telling you what I'm doing." She sat back down slowly. She looked at her wine glass for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them that he recognized. The expression of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and is not sure whether they're being asked to put it down or whether putting it down is something that's even allowed. "I have been afraid of you," she said. "Not afraid that you would hurt me, afraid that you would disappear, that the machinery of what you'd built would eventually consume everything else, and there would be nothing left. And then, when they came to me, I thought if I gave them something small, some small cooperation, I could keep the other thing, keep the part of you that wasn't the organization." She paused. "I was wrong about everything." "Yes," he said. "I know. And yet," he said, "at the end, you told me what was coming. You could have let it happen. You had already committed to the path, already made your choice. But you went to the hospital and you told me what was happening." She was quiet. "Why?" he said. She thought about this for a long moment. "Because," she said, "when I sat beside you, when you couldn't move, and the machines were beeping, and the doctors were talking about you like you were already gone, I realized that I had been afraid of losing you to the organization for so long that I had almost helped the actual people who actually wanted to kill you. And I thought," she stopped, started again, "I thought you deserved the truth." Whatever you were, whatever we were, you deserved the truth. He held her gaze. That is where we start, he said. And us? She said. He looked at her across the table. Next time, he said, choose me. The words were simple, and they carried everything inside them. The understanding that there had been a moment of choosing, that she had not fully chosen him, that something different was possible, that whether it would happen was a question neither of them could answer tonight. It was not forgiveness exactly, it was not a declaration. It was an opening. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the wine glass and turned it slowly in her fingers.
Your nurse called me, she said. The young one. She wanted me to know you were awake before she called anyone else. He hadn't known that. She said you'd been lying there for 8 days hearing everything, and she'd never seen anyone so still who was so clearly thinking. Suyan's mouth curved slightly, almost a smile, complicated in its dimensions. She said you seemed like the kind of person who would know what to do with what you learned. Outside the apartment windows, Seoul was doing what it always did, burning bright and indifferent, 12 million lives moving through the dark in various directions, the city that had made him and nearly unmade him going on without pause. Kang Min-Jae sat in his kitchen with his wife and thought about silence. Not the silence of threat, not the silence that preceded violence, not the calculated silence of the strategist accumulating intelligence. Something else, the silence that comes after, the silence in which something new might carefully be built. A king who listens in silence hears the truth of his kingdom. He had built his kingdom on fear. Fear had turned inward and nearly killed it. What came next, if anything came next, would have to be built on something different. He did not yet know what that was. He suspected it would take longer than 8 days to figure out. He was, for the first time in a long time, willing to find out. Fade to black. If you made it this far, you just watched an entire film. Drop a comment below. Would you want to see a sequel? What do you think Min-Jae will do next? And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell stories that are impossible to stop once you start. See you in the next one.